Chapter 12. The Great Adventure and Rich Winning of the Helmet of Mambrino. It now began to rain, and Sancho would have entered one of the fulling mills for shelter, but Don Quixote had taken such a dislike to them, on account of the jest of which he had been the victim, that he would not go near them. Turning to the right, he made a way into a high road not unlike the one on which they had travelled the day before. Very shortly, Don Quixote espied a man on horseback who wore on his head something that glittered like gold. Scarce had he seen him when he turned to Sancho and said, "Methinks, Sancho, that there is no proverb that is not true, for all proverbs are sentences taken out of experience itself, which is the universal mother of all sciences. And there is a proverb which says, 'When one door shuts, another opens.' I say this because if fortune closed the door for us last night, deceiving us in the adventure of the fulling mills, today it appears wide the door to a better and more certain adventure. For here, if I be not deceived, there comes one towards us that wears on his head the helmet of Mambrino, about which I made the oath thou knowest of." "See well what you say, sir, and better what you do," said Sancho, "for I would not meet with more fulling mills to hammer us out of our senses." "Peace, fellow," cried Don Quixote. "What has a helmet to do with fulling mills?" "I know not," replied Sancho, "but if I may speak as I used to, I would give you such reasons that your worship should see that you are mistaken in what you say." "How can I be mistaken in what I say?" cried Don Quixote. "Tell me, seest thou not that knight who comes riding towards us on a dapple-grey horse, with a helmet of gold on his head?" "That which I see and make out," replied Sancho, "is nothing but a man on a grey ass, like mine, carrying on his head something which shines." "Why, that is Mambrino's helmet," said Don Quixote. "Stand aside and leave me alone with him, and thou shalt see how, without a word, this adventure shall be ended, and the helmet I have longed for be mine." "As to standing aside," muttered Sancho, "that I will take care to do, but I trust this is not another case of fulling mills." "I have already told thee," said Don Quixote angrily, "to make no mention of the mills, and if thou dost not obey me, I vow that I will batter the soul out of thy body." At this, Sancho, fearing lest his master should carry out his threat, held his peace. Now the truth of the matter as to the helmet, the horse, and the knight which Don Quixote saw was this. There were in that neighbourhood 2 villages, the one so small that it had neither shop nor barber, but the larger one had, and the barber, therefore, served the smaller village on any occasion when any one wanted his beard trimmed. It so happened that he was now journeying to the smaller village, bringing with him a brazen basin, and as he rode along it chanced to rain, and therefore, to save his hat, which was a new one, he clapped the basin on his head, and the basin, being clean scoured, glittered half a league off. He rode upon a grey ass, as Sancho said, and that was the reason why Don Quixote took him to be a knight with a helmet of gold, riding on a dapple-grey steed, for everything he came across he made to fit in with the things he had read of in the books of knighthood. And when he saw the unfortunate rider draw near, without stopping to speak a word, he ran at him with his lance, putting Rocinante at full gallop, and intending to pierce him through and through. And as he came up to him, without stopping his horse, he shouted to him, "Defend thyself, caitiff wretch, or else render to me of thine own will what is mine by all the rights of war." The barber, who saw this wild figure bearing down on him, as he was riding along without thought or fear of attack, had no other way to avoid the thrust of the lance than to fall off his ass on to the ground, and no sooner did he touch the earth than he sprang up more nimbly than a deer, and raced away across the plain faster than the wind, leaving behind him on the ground the coveted basin. With this Don Quixote was well content, and said that the pagan was a wise man in leaving behind him that for which he was attacked. Then he commanded Sancho to take up the helmet, who, lifting it, said, "The basin is a good one, and is worth 8 reals if it's worth a farthing." he gave it to his master, who placed it upon his head, turning it about from side to side in search of the visor, and seeing he could not find it, said, "Doubtless the pagan, for whom this helmet was first forged, had a very great head, and the worst of it is that half of the helmet is wanting." When Sancho heard him call the basin a helmet, he could not contain his laughter, but presently, remembering his master's anger, he checked himself in the midst of it. "Why dost thou laugh, Sancho?" said Don Quixote. "I laugh," said he, "to think of the great head the pagan owner of this helmet had, for it is all the world like a barber's basin." "Know, Sancho, that I imagine," replied Don Quixote, "that this famous piece of the enchanted helmet must by some strange accident have fallen into someone's hands that knew not its great worth, and seeing that it was of pure gold, he hath melted down one half, and made of the other half this, which he seems, as thou sayest, to be a barber's basin. But be that as it may, to me, who knows its value, its transformation makes no matter. I will have it altered at the first village where I can find a smith, and meanwhile I will wear it as well as I can, for something is better than nothing, all the more as it will do to protect me against any blow from a stone." "That is," said Sancho, "if they do not shoot from a sling, as they shot in the battle of the two armies, when they made their mark upon your worship's grinders, and broke the oil pot wherein you carried that blessed balsam." "I do not much care for the loss of the balsam," replied Don Quixote, "for as thou knowest, Sancho, I have the receipt for it in my memory." "So have I too," groaned Sancho, "but if ever I make it, or try it again as long as I live, may this be my last hour. But letting that pass, what shall we do with this dapple grey steed that looks so like a grey ass that Martino, or whatever his name was, has left behind him? For, from the haste he made to get away, I do not think he intends to come back, and by my beard the beast is a good one." "I am not accustomed to ransack and spoil those whom I overcome, nor is it the practice of knighthood to take the horses of others, unless the victor chance in combat to lose his own. Therefore, Sancho, leave the horse, or ass, or what else thou pleasest to call it, for when his owner sees us departed, he will return again for it." "Truly," said Sancho, "the laws of knighthood are strict, and if I may not change one ass for another, may I at least change the harness?" "Of that I am not very sure," said Don Quixote, "and, as it is a matter of doubt, you must not change them unless thy need is extreme." "So extreme," said Sancho, "that if they were for mine own person, I could not need them more." So saying, he decked out his ass with 1,000 fineries robbed from the other, and made him look vastly better. Then, having taken a drink at the stream, they turned their backs on the hateful fulling mills, and rode along the high road, Don Quixote all the way describing to Sancho the successes in store for them, until he was interrupted by an adventure that must be told in another chapter. Chapter 13. How Don Quixote set at liberty many poor wretches who were being taken to a place to which they had no wish to go. As they rode onwards, Don Quixote lifted up his eyes and saw, coming along the road, about a dozen men on foot, strung together on a great wire chain like beads. The chain was fastened around their necks, and they had manacles on their hands. There rode with them 2 men on horseback, and 2 others followed on foot. The horsemen had firelocks, and those on foot javelins and swords. As soon as Sancho saw them, he said, "This is a chain of galley slaves, people forced by the king to go to the galleys." "How? People forced?" asked Don Quixote. "Is it possible that the king will force anybody?" "I say not so," answered Sancho, "but they are people condemned for their offences to serve the king in the galleys." "In fact," replied Don Quixote, "however you put it, these folk are being taken where they go by force, and not of their own free will." "That is so," said Sancho. "Then if it be so," continued his master, Here I see before me my duty to redress outrages and to give help to the poor and the afflicted." "I pray you, sir," said Sancho, "consider that justice, representing the king himself, does wrong or violence to nobody, but only punishes those who have committed crimes." By this time the chain of galley slaves came up, and Don Quixote, in very courteous words, asked those in charge of them to be good enough to inform him why they carried people away in that manner. One of the guardians a horseback answered that they were slaves condemned by his majesty to the galleys, and that there was no more to be said, nor ought Don Quixote to desire any further information. "For all that," replied Don Quixote very politely, "I would fain learn from every one of them the cause of his disgrace." To this the guardian a horseback answered, "Although we carry here the register of the crimes of all these wretches, yet if you wish to do so, ask it from themselves, and no doubt they will tell you their stories, for they are men who take delight in boasting of their rascalities." With this permission, which Don Quixote would have taken for himself if they had not given it, he went up to the chain and asked of the first one for what sins he had found himself in such straits. He answered that his offence was no other than for being in love. "For that, and no more?" cried Don Quixote. "But if folks are sent there for being in love, I should have been pulling an oar there long ago." "My love was not of the kind of your worship imagines," replied the galley slave, "for mine was that I loved overmuch a basket stuffed with fine linen, which I embraced so lovingly that if the law had not taken it from me by violence, I should not of my own free will have forsaken it till now. I was taken in the act, and sent for 3 years to the galleys." Don Quixote now inquired of the second his cause of offence, but he answered him not a word, seeming too downcast and melancholy to speak. But the first one spoke for him and said, "Sir, this man goes for being a canary bird. I mean a musician or a singer." "Is it possible," said Don Quixote, "that musicians and singers are sent to the galleys?" "Yes, indeed," said the slave. "There is nothing worse than to sing in anguish." "I do not understand it," said Don Quixote, "but I have heard say that he who sings scares away sorrow." But one of the guards interrupted him and said, "Sir Knight, among these wretches, to sing in anguish means to confess on the rack. They put this poor wretch to the torture, and he was confessed that he was a stealer of beasts. And because he has confessed, he is condemned to the galleys for 6 years. And he is sad and pensive because the other thieves maltreat, abuse, and despise him. For, as they say, a nay has as many letters as a yea, and yet it is good luck for a criminal when there are no witnesses and proofs, and his fate depends on his own tongue, and in my opinion there is much reason in that." "I think so likewise," said Don Quixote, and he passed on to where the third slave stood, and put him to the same question as to the others. The man replied very coolly, saying, "I go to the galleys because I wanted 10 ducats. "I will give thee 20 with all my heart to free thee from that misfortune," said Don Quixote. "That," replied the slave, "would be like one that hath money in the midst of the sea, and yet is dying of hunger because he can get no meat to buy with it. If I had had the 20 ducats your worship offers me at the right time, I would have greased the lawyer's pen with them, and so sharpened the advocate's wit, that instead of being trailed along here like a greyhound, I should now have been walking about in the marketplace of Toledo. But patience, what must be, must be." Don Quixote went from one to another, receiving different answers, until he came to the last, who was a man about 30 years old, of very comely looks, except that he had a squint. He was differently tied from the rest, for he wore a chain to his leg, so long that it wound round his whole body. He had besides round his neck 2 iron rings, from one of which 2 wires came down to his waist, on which were fastened 2 manacles. These held his hands fast locked with a great hanging lock, so that he could neither put his hand to his mouth nor bend down his head to his hands. Don Quixote asked why he was so loaded with iron, more than the rest. The guard answered that it was because he had committed more crimes than all the rest put together, and that he was such a desperate scoundrel that although they carried him tied up in that fashion, they were not sure of him, but feared that he might make an escape. "He goes," continued the guard, "to the galleys for 10 years, and when I tell you he is the infamous Gines of Pasamonte, you will need, I think, to know no more about him." This Gines, who seemed very impatient at the guard's history, broke out into a torrent of abuse, and then turning to Don Quixote said, "Sir Knight, if you have anything to bestow on us, give it us now, and begone, for you do but weary us by wanting to know the stories of other men's lives, and if you want to learn more, know that I am Gines of Pasamonte, whose life has been written by his own hand." "He speaks truly," said the guard, "for he himself hath penned his own history." "And how is the book called?" asked Don Quixote. "It's called The Life of Gines of Pasamonte," replied the slave. "And is it yet ended?" inquired the knight. "How can it be finished?" replied Gines. "See, my life is not yet finished. I intend to finish it in the galleys." "You seem to be a clever fellow," said Don Quixote. "And an unlucky one," replied Gines, "for bad luck always pursues genius." "It pursues knaves," interrupted the guard, and at this Gines burst out again into abuse and bad language, which ended in the guard threatening to beat him with his rod if he did not hold his peace. At this Don Quixote put himself between them, and entreated the guard not to use him hardly, seeing that it was not much that one who carried his hand so tied should have his tongue free. Then turning himself towards the slave, he said, "I have gathered from all you have said, dear brethren, that although they punish you for your faults, yet the pains you suffer do not please you, and that you march towards them with a very ill will. All this prompts me to do that for you, for which I was sent into the world, and for which I became a knight-errant, and to which end I vowed at all times to succor the poor and help those that are oppressed. But as it is prudent not to do by foul means what can be done by fair, I will entreat these gentlemen, your guardians, that they will unloose you and let you depart in peace, for it seems to me a harsh thing to make slaves of those who are born free." And turning to the guards, he continued, "These things I ask of you in a peaceable and quiet manner, and if you grant my request, I shall give you my thanks. But if you will not do it willingly, then shall this lance and sword of mine, guided by the invincible valor of mine arm, force you to do my will." "This is pretty fooling," replied the guard. "Would you have us release to you those the king has imprisoned? Go your way, good sir. Settle the basin on your head more straightly, and study to find out, if you have wits enough, how many feet a cat has." "You are a cat, and a rat, and a knave," said Don Quixote in a rage, and without a word he set on him so fiercely, and without giving him time to defend himself, that he struck him to the earth, badly wounded, with his lance. Luckily for the knight, this was the guard that had the firelock. At first the other guards stood astounded at this unexpected event. They then recovered themselves, and the horsemen drew their swords, the footmen grasped their javelins, and all of them attacked Don Quixote, who quietly prepared to receive them. No doubt he would have been in some danger, but the slaves, seeing a chance of liberty, broke the chain by which they were linked together. The hurly-burly was such that the guards first ran to prevent the slaves getting free, then to defend themselves from Don Quixote, who attacked them, so that they could do nothing to any purpose to keep their prisoners. Sancho, for his part, helped to loose Gines of Pasamonte, who was the first to leap into the field free from all fetters, and setting upon the other overthrown guard, he took his sword and firelock from him. With the latter in his hand, by pointing it at one and aiming it at the other, he cleared the field of all the guards, who were the more easily got rid of because the galley slaves were now all at liberty, and showered at their late keepers volleys of stones. When their victory was complete, Don Quixote called all the slaves together, and they gathered round to hear what he commanded, when he spoke to them as follows. "It is the duty of well-bred people to be grateful for benefits received, and ingratitude is one of the worst of sins. I say this, sirs, because you know what good you have received at my hand, and the only reward I ask is that you all go from here, laden with the chains from which I have just freed your necks, to the city of Toboso, and there present yourselves before the Lady Dulcinea of Toboso, and tell her that her knight of the rueful countenance sends you there to do her service. Relate unto her the way in which I won your freedom, and this being done, you may go then your ways. Guines answered for all the rest, saying, That which you demand is impossible to perform, because we must not travel the roads together, but go alone and divided, to the end that we be not captured again by the guards of the Holy Brotherhood, who will make search for us. To tell us to go to Toboso is as absurd as to seek for pears on an elm tree, and we shall not do it. At this Don Quixote was mightily enraged, and said, I tell thee, Don Guines, or whatever thy name is, that after what thou hast said, thou shalt go thyself alone, with thy tail between thy legs, and bearing the whole length of the chains with thee. Guines, who was a violent fellow, and quite understood that Don Quixote was not very wise, seeing the foolish way in which he had set them at liberty, would not stand this abuse, and winked at his companions, who, stepping aside, sent such a shower of stones against Don Quixote that he had not time to cover himself with his shield, and poor Rocinante was in such terror that he would not move forward to the attack. Sancho ran behind his ass, and by this means sheltered himself from the tempest of stones that rained on both of them. Several stones struck Don Quixote on the body with such force that at last he fell from his horse and on to the ground, and no sooner was he fallen than Guines leaped upon him, and taking the basin from his head, gave him 3 or 4 blows with it on the shoulders, and afterwards struck it on the ground, so as to break it into pieces. They then stripped him of a tunic he wore over his armor, and would have taken his stockings if they could have got them from under his armor. From Sancho they took his coat, leaving him in his shirt sleeves, and dividing the spoils of battle among themselves, they made the best of their way off, each one as it pleased him, with no further thought of their benefactor or his lady Dulcinea of Toboso. The ass, Rocinante, Sancho, and Don Quixote remained alone. The ass, with drooping head, stood shooking his ears every now and then, as if he thought the storm of stones was not yet over. Rocinante lay overthrown by his master, who was lying on the ground. Sancho stood trembling at the thought of the bullets of the Holy Brotherhood, and Don Quixote was amazed to see himself so wickedly used by those to whom he had done so great a service. Chapter 14. Of what befell Don Quixote in the Brown Mountains. Don Quixote, finding himself in such a bad plight, said to his squire, I have often heard it said that to do good to ungrateful men is to cast water into the sea. If I had listened to your advice, I might have avoided this trouble. But now that it is over, there is nothing for it but to be patient and to be wise another time. If you take warning by this, or anything else, replied Sancho, call me a Turk. But, as you say, you might have avoided this trouble by taking my advice. Listen to what I say now, and you will avoid a greater danger. For let me tell you that it is no use talking about knighthood and its customs to the Holy Brotherhood, for it cares not 2 farthings for all the knights errant in the world, and for myself, I seem to hear their arrows buzzing around my ears already. Thou art by nature a coward, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, but thou mayest not say that I am obstinate, and that I never follow thine advice. I will take thy counsel this time, and hide myself from the attacks thou fearest so greatly. But it must be on one condition, that thou never to tell any mortal creature that I withdrew myself out of this danger for fear, but only to humour thy wishes, for if thou sayest anything else, thou liest. Answered Sancho Panza, To retreat is not to run away, nor is it wise to wait where there is more danger than hope, and it is the part of a wise man to spend today in keeping himself safe for tomorrow. Therefore, rude clown as I am, take my advice, and mount Rocinante and follow me as quickly as you are able. Don Quixote mounted Rocinante without another word, and Sancho leading the way on his ass, they entered that part of the Brown Mountains that was near them, a favorite haunt for outlaws and robbers in those days, and a spot where they would be safe from pursuit, for it was Sancho's plan to hide themselves for some days among the crags, so as not to be found, even if the Holy Brotherhood should come and look for them. They arrived that night in the very midst of the mountains, and there Sancho thought it best to spend the night, and indeed as many days as their food lasted. And with this intention they took up their abode among a number of tall trees that grew between two rocks. It happened, however, that Gines of Pasamonte, the famous cheat and robber whom Don Quixote, by his valor and folly, had released from his chains, resolved to hide himself also among the same mountains, and destiny led him to the very spot where Don Quixote and his squire were hiding, and at the very moment that they had fallen asleep, tired out with the day's toil. And as the wicked are always ungrateful, and necessity forces them to evil deeds, Gines, who was neither grateful nor good-natured, resolved to rob Sancho Panza of his ass, not caring for Rocinante, as he thought he was not worth riding or selling. Sancho Panza slept soundly, and while he slept, Gines stole his ass, and before morning he was so far off as to be past finding. The morning sun arose, bringing joy to the earth, but only grief to poor Sancho, for he missed his Dapple, and finding himself deprived of him, he began the saddest and most doleful lamentation possible. And when Don Quixote awoke, he heard him mourning in a most melancholy way, crying out, "Oh, my beloved ass, born in mine own house, the sport of my children, the comfort of my wife, the envy of my neighbors, the ease of my burdens, and, beyond all, the support of my household, for with what I gain daily by thee did I pay half of mine expenses." Don Quixote, who heard this lament, and knew the cause of it, comforted Sancho as best he could, and desired him to have patience, promising to give him a letter to command those at his house to hand over to him 3 out of 5 assfuls that he had at home. Sancho was comforted by this, dried his tears, moderated his sobs, and thanked Don Quixote for the favors he had done him. And as they entered farther among the mountains, the knight felt glad at heart that he had come to a place so suitable for the adventures he was in search of. They reminded him of marvelous stories he had read, of what had happened to knights-errant in similar wild places, and his mind was so full of these things that he thought of nothing else whatever. As for Sancho, he trudged behind his master, loaded with the things that his ass should have carried. While Sancho was thus walking along, he raised his eyes and saw that his master had come to a stop, and was trying, with the point of his lance, to lift what seemed like a bundle that was lying on the ground, upon which he ran to see whether his master wanted his aid, and came up to him just as he was lifting up a saddle-cushion with a portmanteau fastened to it. These were half-rotten and falling to pieces, yet they weighed so much that Sancho's help was required to lift them up. His master ordered him to see what was in the portmanteau, and Sancho obeyed him as quickly as might be. And although it was shut with a chain and a padlock, yet Sancho could see through the rents and tears what was inside it, namely 4 fine holland shirts and other linen clothes, both curious and delicate, besides a handkerchief containing a good quantity of gold. "At last," cried Sancho, "we have met with an adventure worth something." And searching on, he came across a little memorandum book, richly bound. Don Quixote asked him for this, but bade him keep the money for himself. For this rich favor, Sancho kissed his hands, and taking all the linen, he crammed it into their provision bag. Don Quixote, having considered a while, said, "Methinks, Sancho, that some traveller, having lost his way, must have passed over the mountains, and being met by thieves, they slew him and buried him in this secret place." "It cannot be so," answered Sancho, "for if they had been thieves, they would not have left the money behind them." "Thou sayest true," said Don Quixote, "and therefore I cannot guess what can have happened. But stay, we will look at the pocket-book and see whether there is anything written in it by which we may discover what we want to know." He opened it, and the first thing he found in it was a poem, which was all about the author's love for some fair Chloe who would not care for him. Don Quixote read this aloud to Sancho. "Nothing can be learned from these verses," said the squire, "unless by that clue which is there we may get some help."
"What clue is there here?" said Don Quixote.
"I thought your lordship mentioned a clue there."
"I did not say clue, but Chloe," replied Don Quixote, "which no doubt is the name of the lady of whom the author of this poem complains."
After looking through the book again, Don Quixote found a despairing love letter, and several other verses and letters full of laments and misery, from which he came to the conclusion that the owner of the book was some sad, rejected lover. The knight of the rueful countenance was very desirous to know who was the owner of the portmanteau, believing from what he had seen that he must be a man of some position, whom the disdain and cruelty of a fair lady had driven to desperate courses. But as there was no one in this remote and solitary place to satisfy his curiosity, he rode on, taking any road that Rocinante chose, in the firm belief that he would find some strange adventure among the mountains. And as he rode, he saw a man on top of a little mountain, leaping from rock to rock and tuft to tuft with marvelous agility. He made him out to be half naked, with a black and matted beard, his hair long and tangled, his feet unshod, and his legs bare. He wore some breeches of tawny velvet, but these appeared so torn to rags that his skin showed in many places. His head, too, was bare, and although he ran by with all haste, yet was the knight able to mark all these things. But he could not follow him, because it was not in Rocinante's power, being in a weak state and naturally very slow and steady going, to travel over these rough places at any speed. Don Quixote at once came to the conclusion that he was the owner of the portmanteau, and resolved to go in search of him, even if he should have to spend a whole year in the mountains till he found him. So he commanded Sancho to go on one side of the mountain, while he went on the other. "And," said he, "one of us may thus come across this man who has vanished so suddenly out of our sight." "I dare not do so," replied Sancho, "for on parting one step from you, fear seizes me and fills me with 1,000 kinds of terror and affright. Let me say, once for all, that henceforth I do not stir a finger's breadth from your presence."
"Well," replied Don Quixote, "I am glad that thou dost build upon my valor, which shall not fail thee even though everything else fails thee. Follow me, then, and keep thine eyes open, so that we may find this strange man, who is no doubt the owner of the portmanteau."
"Surely," said Sancho, "it were better not to find him, for if we should meet him, and he turned out to be the owner of the money, we should have to return it to him. Let us rather keep it faithfully until someone turns up to claim it, when perhaps I shall have spent it all, and in that case I shall be free from blame."
"In that thou art mistaken, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "for now that we have a suspicion who the owner is, we are bound to search him out and restore him his money."
So saying, Don Quixote led the way, and in a little time they came upon a dead mule, half devoured by dogs and crows, and as they were looking at it, they heard a whistle, such as shepherds use, and there appeared at their left hand a great number of goats, and behind them on the top of the mountain was the goatherd, who was quite an old man. Don Quixote called to him, and begged him to come down to where they stood, and the goatherd, after looking at them for a few minutes, in surprise at seeing them in this lonely spot, descended to where they stood. "I wager," he said as he came towards them, "that you are wondering how the mule came there that lies dead in that bottom. Well, it has been lying there these 6 months. Tell me, have you come across his master yet?"
"We have fallen in with nobody," replied Don Quixote, "but a saddle cushion and a portmanteau, which we found not far from here."
"I have also found the same portmanteau," said the goatherd, "but I would never take it up nor approach it, for fear some ill luck should come upon me, or lest some one should accuse me of theft."
"Tell me, my good fellow," said Don Quixote, "do you know who is the owner of these things?"
"All I can tell you is this," said the goatherd, "that some 6 months ago, more or less, there arrived at one of our sheepfolds, some 3 leagues off, a young gentleman of comely presence, mounted on that mule which lies dead there, and with the same saddle cushion and portmanteau that you have seen. He asked us which was the most hidden part of the mountain, and we told him that this was, which is certainly true, for if you go a league further on, perhaps you might not find your way out, and indeed
I marvel how you found your way in so readily." As soon as the young man had heard our answer, he turned his bridle and went towards the place we showed him and made towards these mountains. After that, we did not see him for a good many days, until one day, when one of our shepherds came by with provisions, he attacked him and beat him and carried off all the bread and cheese that he carried, and then fled away back again into the mountains. When we heard of this, some of us goatherds went to look for him, and spent almost 2 days in the most solitary places in the mountains, and in the end found him lurking in the hollow part of a large cork tree. He came out to us very meekly, his clothes torn and his face burned by the sun, so that we hardly knew him again. He saluted us courteously, and in a few civil words told us not to wonder at his condition, for he was working out a penance placed upon him for the sins he had committed. We begged him to tell us who he was, but he would not do so. We begged him also that when he had need of food, he would tell us where we might find him, and we would willingly bring it to him, and told him there was no need to take it by force. He thanked us very much for our offer, and asked pardon for his violence, and promised in future to ask food of our shepherds without giving annoyance to anyone. But even while he was speaking to us, he bit his lips and bent his brows, and it was clear some fit of madness was upon him, for he cried out, "O treacherous Fernando, here thou shalt pay me the injury thou didst me. These hands shall rend thy heart," and many other wild and whirring words which he addressed to some Fernando. But at the same time he fell upon one of our goatherds, and we had no little trouble to get him away. Then, without another word, he fled to the briars and the brambles, where we could not follow him. By this we think he has a madness which comes upon him at times, for sometimes he will take his food from our shepherds with courtesy and humanity. At others he seizes it by force, though they are ever willing to give it. We have thought to take him by force to the town of Almodovar to see if he can be cured, or to find out if he has any relatives to whom we can restore him. This, sirs, is all that I can tell you of what you have asked me, and for certain he it is who is the owner of the things you have found."
Don Quixote was greatly amazed by what he had heard, and determined to search for him through the mountains, without leaving a corner or cave unsought, until he had found him. Chapter 15. The Story of Cardenio. Fortune favored Don Quixote in his search for the strange owner of the portmanteau, for even as he was speaking to the goatherd, he appeared at that very instant through a gorge of the mountain, murmuring to himself words which one could not have understood near at hand, much less afar off. His clothes were such as have been described, only differing in this, that when he drew near, Don Quixote noticed that he wore a leather jerkin, which, though tattered and torn, was perfumed with amber. From this he guessed that the man who wore such garments was a person of quality. On coming towards them, the youth addressed them in a hoarse tone, but with great courtesy, and Don Quixote returned his greetings with equal kindness, and, alighting from Rocinante, went to meet him, and clasping him in his arms, embraced him as though he had known him for a very long time. Then the stranger, whom we may call the tattered one, addressed the knight of the rueful countenance in the following words: "Truly, good sir, whoever you may be, for I know you not, thank you with all my heart for your grace and courtesy towards me, and wish only that I could repay you some of the kindness you shower on me." "So great is my desire to serve you," replied Don Quixote, "that I was fully resolved never to part out of these mountains until I had found you, and heard from your own lips whether there was any remedy for your grief. For it is a consolation in sorrow to have some one to condole with you, and I entreat you, sir, tell me who you are, and what has brought you to live and die in these solitudes like a brute beast. For I swear by the high honour of knighthood which I have received, that if you will tell me everything, I will either help you in all good earnest to overcome your troubles, or, if that cannot be, then I will assist in lamenting them." The tattered one looked at Don Quixote from head to foot, and stared at him in amazement for a long time. At length he said, "If you have anything to eat, give it to me, and after I have eaten, I will do all that you ask in return for the kindness you show me." Sancho and the goatherd then gave him what food they had, and this he devoured with the eagerness of a wild beast, so that he seemed to swallow the food rather than chew it, and whilst he ate, the others left him in peace. Having ended his dinner, he made signs to them to follow him, which they did, and he took them to a little meadow hard by, that place at the back of the mountain. Arriving there, he laid himself down on the grass. The others doing the same, he began as follows. My name is Cardenio, the place of my birth one of the best cities in Andalusia. My lineage noble, my parents rich, and my misfortunes so great that I think no one was ever to be pitied as I am. There dwelt in the same city wherein I was born a damsel as noble and rich as I was, whose name was Lucinda. I loved, honored, and adored Lucinda from earliest childhood, and she loved me with all the earnestness of youth. Our parents knew of our love, and were not sorry to see it, and so we grew up in mutual esteem and affection. Ah, how many letters have I written, and how many verses have I penned, and how many songs has she inspired. At length the time came when I could wait no longer, and I went to ask her of her father for my lawful wife. He answered that he thanked me for the desire I showed to honor him and to honor myself with his love treasure, but that my father being alive, it was by strict right his business to make that demand. For if it were not done with his good will and pleasure, Lucinda was not the woman to be taken or given by stealth. I thanked him for his kindness, and feeling there was reason in what he said, I hurried to my father to tell him my desires. At the moment I entered his room, he was standing with a letter open in his hand, and before I could speak to him, he gave it to me, saying as he did so, By that letter, Cardenio, you may learn the desire that the Duke Ricardo has to do you favor. This Duke Ricardo, you must know, gentlemen, is a grande of Spain, whose dukedom is situated in the best part of all Andalusia. I took the letter and read it, and it was so very kind that it seemed to me wrong that my father should not do what he asked, for he wanted me as a companion, not as a servant, to his eldest son, and offered to advance me in life if he should find me worthy. I read the letter and could see that it was no time now to speak to my father, who said to me, Cardenio, thou must be ready in 2 days to depart, and to do all that the Duke desires, and be thankful that such a future lies open before thee. The time for my departure arrived. I spoke to my dear Lucinda, and also to her father, and begged him to wait for a while, until I knew what the Duke Ricardo wanted of me, and until my future was certain. He promised not to bestow his daughter elsewhere, and she vowed to be always faithful to me, and so I left. I was indeed well received by the Duke Ricardo, and nobly treated. His elder son liked me well and was kind to me, but the one who rejoiced most at my coming was Fernando, his second son, a young man who was both noble, gallant, and very comely. In a short time he had so made me his friend that there were no secrets between us, and he told me all his thoughts and desires, and confided to me a love affair of his own, which caused him much anxiety. He had fallen in love with the daughter of a farmer, his father's vassal, whose parents were rich, and she herself was beautiful, modest, and virtuous. But he did not dare to tell his father of his love, because of their difference in rank, and though he had promised to marry this farmer's daughter, he had come to fear that the Duke would never consent to let him carry out his desire. He told me that he could find no better mode of keeping the remembrance of her beauty out of his mind than by leaving home for some months, and he suggested that we should both depart for a while to my father's house, under the pretense of going to buy horses, for the city where I was born was a place where they bred the best horses in the world. When I heard of his wishes, I did all I could to strengthen them, and urged him to carry out his plan, which offered me a chance of seeing once more my dear Lucinda. At last the Duke gave him leave, and ordered me to go with him. We arrived at my native city, and my father gave him the reception due to his rank. I again saw Lucinda. My love for her increased, though indeed it had never grown cold, and to my sorrow I told Don Fernando all about it, for I thought by the laws of friendship it was not right to hide anything from him. I described her beauty, her grace, and her wit, with such eloquence that my praises stirred in him a desire to see a damsel enriched by such rare virtues. To my misfortune I yielded to his wish, and took him with me one night to a window where Lucinda and I were wont to speak together. He stood mute as one beside himself, and from that moment he could speak nothing but praises of my Lucinda. Yet I confess that I took no pleasure in hearing her thus praised, because it roused in me a strange feeling of jealousy. I did not fear the faith and honor of Lucinda, but at the same time I felt a hidden terror of the future. Now Don Fernando continued, as my friend, to read all the letters I sent to Lucinda, or she to me, under the pretense that he took great delight in the wit of both of us. And it fell out that Lucinda asked me to send her a book of the knightly adventures of Amadis of Gaul. No sooner did Don Quixote hear the name of one of his favorite heroes than he interrupted the story, saying, "If, my good sir, you had told me that your lady Lucinda was a reader of knightly adventures, you need not have said anything else to make me acknowledge her wit. Waste no further words on her beauty and worth, for now I assert that from her devotion to books of knighthood, the Lady Lucinda is the fairest and most accomplished woman in all the world. Pardon my interruption, but when I hear anything said of the books of knights errant, I can no more keep from speaking of them than sunbeams can help giving forth warmth. Therefore, forgive me, and proceed." While Don Quixote was speaking, Cardenio held his head down. His face grew sullen, and he bit his lip. When he looked up, he seemed to have forgotten all about his story, and in a burst of rage said, "A plague on all your books of knighthood! Amadis was a fool, and the Queen Madissima was a wicked woman." "By all that is good," replied Don Quixote in great anger, for this queen was a favorite heroine of his, "it is a villainy to say such a thing. The Queen Madissima was a very noble lady, and whoever says or thinks the contrary lies like an arrant coward, and this I will make him know, o horseback or afoot, armed or disarmed, by night or day, as he liketh best." Cardenio stood gazing at Don Quixote strangely, for now the mad fit was on him, and hearing himself called liar and coward, he caught up a stone that was near him, and gave the knight such a blow with it that he threw him backwards on the ground. Sancho Panza, seeing his master so roughly handled, set upon the madman with his fists, but the tattered one overthrew him with one blow, and trampled him under his feet like dough. After this he departed into the wood very quietly. Sancho got up and wanted to take vengeance on the goatherd, who, he said, should have warned them about the madman. The goatherd declared he had done so, and Sancho retorted that he had not, and from words they got to blows, and had seized each other by the beards, when Don Quixote parted them, saying that the goatherd was in no way to blame for what had happened. He then again inquired where Cardenio was likely to be found, and the goatherd repeated that he had said at first that his abode was uncertain, but that if they went much about in these parts, they would be sure to meet with him either mad or sane.